Okay, so what we're going to talk about now are sensory receptors. And as the name implies, what sensory receptors do is they detect sensory information, and we call this sensory information stimuli. After it detects that information, it transmits it via sensory neurons to the central nervous system for processing. So here we have the eye that's detecting sensory information, then that information travels via sensory neurons to the central nervous system for integration. Now, sensory receptors and sensory neurons can be part of large, complex sensory organs such as the eye, but a lot of the times, and especially like in the skin, all these sensory receptors is they're modified dendritic endings. So these are all sensory neurons here. This is a sensory neuron. And this is the receptive region up there. These are modified dendritic regions, and that's the actual sensory receptor. And then after that information is detected, it's sent down the sensory neuron toward the axon terminal. Okay, so there's multiple places that we find sensory receptors in the body. And one of those main locations is in the skin. So we have sensory receptors that are located in the skin, and what they're doing is they're detecting stimuli arising outside of the body. So here we have a diagram of the skin. Here's the epidermis. There's the dermis, and right in there in those dermal papilla, we have all these sensory receptors. Now, what types of senses or stimuli are these sensory receptors detecting? Same thing as we have going on here. Same thing as we have going on here. All different types of touch and pressure. Okay. And then what about here? What are we detecting there? We're detecting hot. We're detecting cold. What are we detecting there? We're detecting pain. So all of these sensory receptors in the skin all detect this type of information. We also have sensory receptors that are located in places like skeletal muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joint capsules. So here we have a skeletal muscle, and you can see that there's these sensory receptors that are located within the skeletal muscle. Same thing with this tendon here. Tendons connect skeletal muscle to bone. We have these sensory receptors that are located within the tendon. Okay. Now, what are these receptors? What are these sensory receptors detecting in the muscles, skeletal muscle, in the tendons, in the ligament? They're detecting stretch. Okay, this is something the body definitely wants to know about, is if the muscles or the tendons are being stretched, especially excessively. And the receptors that we find in these positions, in the skeletal muscle, tendons, ligaments, and joint capsules, we call these proprioceptors. And what they're doing by sending this stretch information up to the brain, by the way, this is what's happening there. We have this stretch information, and it's taken up to the brain for processing. But what this does by sending this stretch information up there is it's advising the brain of body position. Okay, it's telling ourselves where our body is relative to space. And it's doing that by detecting this stretch movement and sending that information to the brain. You guys don't have to know the details of this, but this just kind of shows how it works. You have these muscle spindles there. And normally they're stretched a little bit and they generate some action potentials. But then what happens is that when the muscle is stretched more, maybe you contract it, or maybe it's being stretched too much, then the action potential frequency gets much greater. And so that information is taken to the brain, and now the brain says, all right, the muscle is being stretched too much and we can do something about it. So this all falls under these proprioceptors, all fall under this kind of category called proprioception, or they assist with proprioception. And what proprioception is it's the sense of position of one's own body part. There we go. It's the sense of positions of one's own body part. It basically tells us where we are in in relation to space. And a good example of how you can demonstrate this is you can close your eyes here and then take your fingers and try to touch your fingers, for example, to all of these individual other fingers. Or you can take a finger and try to touch your nose. And the reason you can do that, the reason you know exactly where your finger is, relative to your nose or to your other fingers, is because by all this movement here is causing stretch, and those proprioceptors are being activated, which travels to the brain and lets our brain know exactly where our fingers are and our other joints are relative to space. And neurological diseases can affect this proprioception. So there are things you can do to test for this proprioception to see if this sensory system is inhibited or damaged for some reason. All right, so sensory receptors can be classified according to how they're activated or stimulated. And these are all the different types of sensory receptors that we find right there. So on that note, they can be classified as photoreceptors, thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, or nociceptors. And my question to you is, how would you classify receptors that detect touch and detect stretch? Well, you'd classify those as mechanoreceptors. These all respond to mechanical force. And how that happens is that here's a mechanoreceptor right there, and this is when it's not being disturbed. But then when you have a touch sensation, for instance, that mechanical touch deforms the receptor, allows ions to travel in, and that electrically stimulates the receptor, electrically stimulates the cell. Where is this information going and why? It's going to the central nervous system for integration. What about receptors that detect temperature? How would you detect those? Not surprisingly, those are thermoreceptors. We have receptors that detect cold, warm, all that kind of stuff. And so here we have some, we'll say, warm water traveling down, and that stimulates the sensory receptor. Then that sensory receptor sends that information up to the brain for processing. Now here's a question for you though. What would happen if you had damage to the nerve that takes that sensory information to the brain? Would the receptor be stimulated? Would this receptor still be stimulated? It would. Would you feel the sensation, however? You would not feel the sensation. And that's because this information, to actually feel it, it needs to arrive at the central nervous system. Now, what if the temperature is burning hot or freezing cold? What if the pressure is super, super intense? What type of sensory receptors are we activating now? Well, we're not activating thermo or mechanoreceptors. What we do now is we activate nociceptors. And what do nociceptors detect? Nociceptors detect pain. So here in this diagram, here you can see that thermoreceptors detect warm. But once you get outside of that and you get into the hot, burning hot, that's when these nociceptors are detected. Same thing with cold. Here's cold receptors. Those are thermoreceptors. But once you get into the freezing cold, then you start activating the nociceptors. And when this information goes to the brain, when nociceptors are activated and goes to the brain, what happens then? What kind of sensation do you feel? That's when you feel pain. Again, pain is not felt. All of this sensory information is not felt until the information reaches the brain. And so we can talk about that stuff there. All right, on to the special senses. So there are 5 special senses, and they're detected by sense organs that are all confined to the head region. So we have the tongue, the nose, the ears, the eyes. Okay, and all of these, and then this is the skin. This is not a special sense. So back to the tongue. What special sense is detected by the tongue? That's taste. What special sense is detected by the nose? That's smell, also called olfaction. What about the ears? There's two here, two at the ears. There is balance / equilibrium, and also sound. And then what about the eyes? There were that allows for vision. Okay, so let's just run through some of these here. Let's first talk about smell, which is also called olfaction. So here we are up in the nasal cavity, and this is a close-up look of that. And if we take a close-up look at that, this is the nasal cavity right here. So this is where airborne chemicals, odor chemicals are coming through. And these are actually the sensory neurons right there. These are the sensory receptor regions, and then these are all the sensory neurons that take that information toward the brain. Now, what has to happen for these sensory receptors to be stimulated? Well, we have to have an odor molecule, and that odor molecule has to actually dissolve in this mucus layer. And once they dissolve in that mucus layer, that allows these sensory receptors to detect that odor molecule. And it's actually, the odor molecule actually binds to the sensory receptor. Okay, it binds to the sensory receptor, then it activates a whole pathway, which results in an electrical signal, which then goes towards the brain. Vision. We have sensory receptors in the eyes that detect light waves. These are all different light waves here, and that's detected again by the eye. So specifically, these light waves come through and they go through the cornea, go through the lens, go through the vitreous humor back here, and they hit this area in the back of the eye called the retina. And this is where the the sensory receptors are at. Since I just gave it away, sensory receptors that respond to light energy are called photoreceptors. So that light information goes to the back of the eye. It stimulates these photoreceptors, and then that information travels up through this complicated pathway to the brain for processing. Gustation, or taste. So on the tongue here, we have these little nipple-shaped projections called papilla, and within those papilla, we find taste buds. And these taste buds contain taste receptors. So again, what happens here is that food chemicals dissolve in saliva, and that allows these sensory receptors to detect those food chemicals. And once they're stimulated, then that taste information goes to the brain for processing. And by the way, we don't taste it until it hits the central nervous system. Something I passed up on here, oh no, I haven't yet. I did here. Yeah. So sensory receptors that respond to chemicals in solution. So these odor molecules have to dissolve in mucus before they can stimulate the receptors. So what do we call these types of receptors where we first have to dissolve these chemicals in solution? We call them chemoreceptors. And these receptors that we find on the tongue that detect taste are also chemoreceptors. All right, on to auditory or hearing. Hearing is accomplished via the inner ear. I guess I can give you you guys aren't responsible for this specific anatomy, but you have the external ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. There's the external ear, middle ear, and inner ear. And basically what happens is sound waves travel through the external ear. They hit on your eardrum, and that vibration stimulates these three small bones, the malleus and the incus and the stapes, to vibrate. And then that vibration is sent to this snail-like structure called the cochlea. So now you have these vibrations in the cochlea, and that's where we find the receptors that are going to detect sound. And specifically what happens is that when sound comes in, these are those sensory receptors right here. What happens is when sound comes in, it deflects what they call these cilia. So this is non-stimulated right there, but when sound waves come in, these receptors deflect, and when they do, it allows potassium ions to come in, which electrically stimulates the cell. That's a lightning bolt. Okay, it electrically stimulates the cell, and it takes that information via the cochlear nerve to the central nervous system for processing. What type of receptors are these? Mechanoreceptors. Balance and equilibrium. Balance and equilibrium is also detected by the inner ear, but instead of the cochlear region, it's up here in what we call this vestibule region in the semicircular canals. But the principle's kind of the same. Okay, and what this is doing is it's monitoring the position of the head. And when your head is straight up, like so, these sensory receptors are upright and they're not stimulated. But if you move your head forward, you move it back, what happens is these receptors get tilted along with it. And when they get tilted, these potassium ions again come through, and it stimulates the sensory receptor. And then that information goes to the brain for processing. What type of receptors are these? Again, they're mechanoreceptors. Something I want to point out, proprioception, I gave it a definition before, but I guess this is a better one. Proprioception is an awareness of the position and movement of the body. We're aware of the position and movement of the body. And this not only depends on those proprioceptors, those stretch receptors, but it also depends on these on the inner ear. In particular, the receptors that monitor balance and equilibrium. It also depends on the eyes. And so you have these three peripheral sources that are all sending information to the brain, which gives us a sense of proprioception. All right. And then lastly, I want to look to receptors that are actually detecting information inside the body. So these are receptors that are responding to stimuli inside the body, and we call these visceroceptors. You don't have to know that term, but it's just to classify in here. So what type of sensory information do we want to detect inside the body? Well, basically, any variable that we want to maintain homeostasis over, we need to detect that. So here we have this is the heart would be right there, and this is the aorta, and we have these receptors called baroreceptors located in the aortic arc. And this is a type of mechanoreceptor. What type of information are these baroreceptors detecting? They're detecting blood pressure. So they detect blood pressure, then that information goes to the central nervous system for processing, which activates effector organs to bring blood pressure back to where it needs to be. What other types of things do we detect? We detect temperature. And this is the hypothalamus in the brain, and there's actually little, let's see, there it is right there. There's actually sensory receptors located in that part of the hypothalamus that detect temperature. What are some other things that we want to detect? How about pH? Okay, so we have chemoreceptors in blood vessels and in the brain that respond to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion, which whose concentration is directly related to pH. So that's another thing that we want to detect. And then lastly, here's another example. This is in the gut. This is in the small intestine. And this could be actually anywhere in the GI tract. But the point being is that we want to move food through the gastrointestinal tract here. How do we do that? And that's what this is illustrating right here. You don't have to know the specifics. We talk about this in 242. It's just an example. But essentially what happens is that food travels down here. It stretches the wall of the GI tract. This is a stretch receptor there. It's a mechanoreceptor. And what happens is it's stimulated, and that goes, and it actually doesn't go to the central nervous system. What it does is it activates a neuron behind it that causes contraction of this smooth muscle. And that causes the food bolus to be propelled through the gastrointestinal tract. So again, just another example of a sensory receptor we find inside the body.